What if I told you that one of the most shocking images the royal family could ever produce wasn't a golden carriage rolling through London, wasn't a glittering coronation at Westminster Abbey, but instead a scene of humiliation? Imagine it. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, once the glamorous rebels of the monarchy, now brought to their knees, literally, begging King Charles for permission to return. Now let that sink in. A prince, born into privilege, and his Hollywood-born wife, once celebrated as modern icons of a new monarchy, forced to plead like outcasts before the very institution they once walked away from. Doesn't that sound like a twist you never thought you'd see coming? And yet, here we are. But here's the kicker. The ending of this scene wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. It was rejection so cold, so final, that it may have rewritten the future of the monarchy forever. Charles, looking his son in the eyes, declared, "You and Meghan are not, and will never be, welcome back." Can you imagine hearing that from your own father? Can you imagine being banished, not just from a family gathering, but from the entire foundation of your identity? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The story we're about to unpack isn't just another royal squabble. It's not gossip over tea or idle chatter about tiaras and tabloids. This is a story about legacy, betrayal, survival, and the fatal decisions that define kingship. Because make no mistake, King Charles didn't just make a decision as a father. He made a decision as a monarch, with the weight of centuries of tradition pressing down on his shoulders. And the timing of this so-called ban couldn't have been more explosive. Why now? That's the burning question. Why? After years of public feuds, Netflix specials, podcasts, and memoirs, would Harry and Meghan suddenly decide they wanted to return to the very life they abandoned? And why, after years of being criticized for being too soft, too indulgent, did King Charles finally draw a line in the sand? We're going to peel back every layer of this scandal. We'll look at how the Sussexes' empire crumbled in California. We'll dig into the growing distance between Harry and his brother William. We'll examine the icy shadow of Queen Camilla, whispering advice into Charles's ear. We'll explore how advisors, Parliament, and public opinion shaped a moment that may go down in history as the ultimate act of royal exile. But before we dive into all of that, let's pause and ask the most uncomfortable question. Was this scene even real? Did Harry and Meghan truly kneel before Charles? Or is this a symbolic image capturing the desperate state of their relationship with the monarchy? Whether literal or metaphorical, the picture is devastating. For two people who built their brand on independence, empowerment, and breaking free from tradition, begging to return is the ultimate irony. And Charles, who spent decades as the understudy to his mother, may have just performed the boldest act of his reign. Think about the contradictions at play here. Harry once declared the UK unsafe. Meghan spoke of the royal family in tones that ranged from icy disapproval to outright condemnation. Together, they painted themselves as victims of an institution that suffocated them. And yet, after all that, they come back, pleading for the very crown they once spurned. Isn't it strange how history twists itself? Isn't it strange how pride can turn into desperation? And what about Charles? For decades, he was cast as the weak heir, the indecisive man overshadowed by his mother's iron rule. Critics said he'd never have the strength to make tough calls. But in that moment, staring at the son who betrayed him and the daughter-in-law who vilified his family, Charles did what few expected. He chose the crown over compassion. He chose the monarchy over his son. But here's where it gets even more gripping. This wasn't just a personal decision. This was political. Every monarch lives with a shadow audience, advisors, media, parliament, and above all, the people. Charles knew that welcoming Harry and Meghan back could be seen as weakness. He knew that forgiveness could unravel what little stability the monarchy has left. So he slammed the door. But in slamming that door, did he secure the monarchy's survival, or did he fatally wound it? That's the tension we'll unravel tonight. Because let's be honest, forgiveness feels human. Rejection feels cruel. And yet cruelty, when wielded as strategy, can sometimes save an empire or destroy it. Now, I want you to picture the scene again. Imagine the grand hallway at Clarence House, gilded frames on the wall, guards standing stiff in the background. Harry head bowed. Meghan, her Hollywood mask slipping, a flash of panic in her eyes. Charles, standing tall, shoulders squared, channeling not just his own anger, but centuries of royal authority. In that single instant, the dynamic flipped. No longer was Charles the fragile monarch, overshadowed by scandal. He became the immovable mountain. And Harry and Meghan? They became wanderers at the gates, denied entry. But ask yourself this: how did it come to this? How did a father and son who once laughed together, who once shared grief at Diana's funeral, arrive at such a catastrophic moment? Was this fate sealed long ago, or was there still a chance, just one chance, for reconciliation? And most importantly, what comes next? Because if Charles can say never, what happens when the public, or Parliament, or even history itself disagrees with him? Hold on to those questions. Because as we move forward, we'll discover that this wasn't a snap judgment, wasn't a rash act of cruelty. It was the result of years of betrayal, years of pressure, and years of watching Harry and Meghan dismantle the royal family from the outside. And when the moment came, Charles knew he couldn't afford another mistake. But what exactly drove him to this point? What warnings did he receive? What secrets were whispered in his ear? And who, among the royals, stood behind him when he declared his son unwelcome? Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Can you imagine it? A prince once hailed as the people's favorite, a duke who once stood proudly beside the queen, now reduced to a man on his knees, his voice cracking, his pride shattered, his eyes searching desperately for a glimmer of mercy from his father. This isn't the fairy tale image the world expected. This is not the triumphant homecoming of the exiled son. This is humiliation. Raw, unfiltered, and unforgettable. Now pause for a moment. Picture Meghan Markle, once Hollywood's golden girl, the dazzling duchess in designer gowns, kneeling beside him. Her face, usually so composed, carved in confidence, now pale, trembling, perhaps even glistening with tears. She, too, was begging to return, begging for redemption, begging for a place in the family she had scorned, criticized, and all but abandoned. Can you see the irony? This is the moment that rewrote everything. And yet, it's the moment no one ever expected to see. How did it come to this? From the glittering days of their wedding, watched by billions worldwide, filled with promises of a modernized monarchy, to the bitterness of their retreat to California, Harry and Meghan's story has been a saga of extremes. But this image of kneeling represents the ultimate fall from grace. Because kneeling is more than posture. It's a symbol. It's submission. And in this case, it was a plea from two people who once thought they had the world at their feet. Think about it. Harry and Meghan once stood on international stages, shaking hands with presidents and celebrities, signing multi-million-dollar deals, claiming their independence as if it were their crown. They told the world they no longer needed the palace. They told us they no longer wanted the constraints of the monarchy. They said they were free. And yet, here they were, kneeling, stripped of that very freedom, realizing the cost of their choices. But let's rewind. Why would Harry and Meghan even consider returning to the institution they once ran from? Was it loneliness? Financial instability? The fading of their celebrity sparkle in Hollywood? Or was it something deeper, something darker, like a gnawing fear that without the crown, they were nothing? Let's not forget, Hollywood is fickle. Fame is fleeting. A Netflix deal can vanish. A Spotify contract can be pulled. A reputation can crumble overnight. And that's exactly what happened. Their big projects? Cancelled. Their reputation? Mocked in tabloids, lampooned in comedy sketches, dissected by critics. Even friends who once praised them were suddenly silent. Can you imagine the silence in their California mansion? Can you imagine the whispers of failure echoing through its luxurious halls? So, what do you do when the world outside turns its back on you? You look back to where you came from. You look back to the institution you once rejected. And in Harry and Meghan's case, they looked back to Buckingham Palace, to King Charles. But here's the problem. You can't just stroll back into the royal family as if nothing happened. You can't erase the interviews, the memoirs, the documentaries filled with accusations. You can't pretend you didn't drag your own family through the mud. So instead of a confident return, they were forced into desperation. They didn't walk tall through the palace gates. They knelt. And in kneeling, they admitted something profound. They needed the crown more than the crown needed them. Imagine the tension in that room. guards standing still, courtiers looking away, the weight of silence pressing down like a stone. Harry's voice cracking as he whispered, "Father, please." Meghan clutching his arm, her eyes darting between Charles's stern face and the floor beneath her. And Charles? He didn't flinch. He didn't bend. The years of betrayal had hardened him. And that's the twist here. For years, Charles had been painted as soft, indecisive, too eager to please. The man who bowed to public opinion. The man who lived in the shadow of Diana. But in that moment, Charles was none of those things. He was the king. And kings don't bow. Kings don't bend. Kings decide. But let's ask the question no one dares to ask. Was this really about Harry and Meghan, or was this about the monarchy itself? Because by kneeling, Harry wasn't just asking for his father's forgiveness. He was asking for something far more dangerous. He was asking for re-entry into an institution that thrives on control, hierarchy, and image. And Charles knew the risk. Bringing Harry and Meghan back wouldn't just tarnish the monarchy, it could destroy it. Think of the message it would send. After years of accusations, of racism, cruelty, neglect, welcoming Harry and Meghan back would look like the monarchy admitting guilt. It would look like surrender. And Charles, whatever his personal feelings, couldn't afford that. Not for himself. Not for William. Not for the crown. But still, imagine the heartbreak. A father rejecting his son. A family fractured beyond repair. A kingdom watching in stunned silence. Was there ever a chance for forgiveness? Or was this fate sealed the moment Harry and Meghan chose California over crown? I want you to ask yourself this. If you were in Harry's shoes, would you have knelt? Would you have swallowed your pride after years of rebellion just to be let back in? Or would you have stood tall, even in exile, refusing to bow again to the institution you once condemned? Because Harry chose to kneel, Meghan chose to kneel, and Charles chose to reject them. But here's where it gets even more shocking. This moment, this humiliating plea, wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Because Charles's rejection didn't happen in a vacuum. It was influenced, shaped, even demanded by forces far greater than one family feud. Advisors, parliament, the future of the monarchy itself. All of these played a role in Charles's decision. And as Harry and Meghan rose from their knees, stunned and broken, the real storm was only just beginning. Because what Charles did next would ignite headlines across the globe, divide public opinion, and set the stage for a royal battle unlike any we've ever seen. But what exactly did Charles say in that final, fatal moment? And who whispered in his ear before he spoke those words? The answers to those questions will take us deeper into the heart of this royal drama, and they'll leave you rethinking everything you thought you knew about the monarchy. Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Why would a father look his own son in the eyes and say, "You are not welcome"? Why would a king, a man burdened with the weight of history, duty, and public opinion, choose exile over reconciliation? To understand that moment of rejection, we need to go back to the roots of this rift. Because the truth is, this decision didn't happen overnight. It was built, brick by brick, betrayal by betrayal, until the wall between Charles and Harry was too high to climb. Think about where it all began. Not with Meghan, not with California, not even with Netflix. It began with trust. The bond between a father and son, forged in grief after Diana's death, began to crack long before the cameras caught on. Charles was a man who lived under relentless scrutiny, and Harry was the boy who never escaped it. Their relationship was fragile, and fragility, when tested, often shatters. Now, add Meghan Markle to the picture. For a brief moment, it seemed like her arrival might heal things. Do you remember the wedding? The smiles? The promises of modernity? The talk of a new era for the monarchy? For a fleeting second, Charles may have believed his son had found a partner who could anchor him, stabilize him, give him the family security Diana's death had stolen. He even walked Meghan halfway down the aisle, an image that screamed acceptance. But that acceptance would not last, because soon after came the accusations, the whispers, the tell-all interviews, the private grievances aired in public. Harry and Meghan didn't just leave the monarchy. They set it on fire on their way out. Oprah, the Netflix docuseries, the memoir Spare, each one a dagger in the monarchy's side. Let's pause here. Ask yourself, if your own child went on television, watched by millions, and said that you and your family were racist, cold, and complicit in their suffering, would you forgive them? Would you invite them back to your home for tea as if nothing had happened? Or would you, like Charles, draw a line? Harry accused his father of cutting him off financially. He accused Camilla of leaking stories to the press. He painted William as violent, jealous, even cruel. And Meghan? She implied the monarchy let her suffer in silence, hinting that her very life was in danger. These weren't small accusations. These were bombs, and each one exploded in the global press. Every time Harry and Meghan spoke, Charles's silence grew heavier. Every revelation chipped away at the chance of reconciliation. And behind closed doors, Charles's advisors were watching. They weren't just thinking about father and son. They were thinking about crown and kingdom. Could a monarchy survive if the prodigal prince was allowed to return after torching its image in front of the entire world? Could Charles still command respect if he forgave what many saw as unforgivable? The roots of rejection are tangled in this dilemma. On one side, the love of a father. On the other, the duty of a king. For Charles, those two sides collided the moment Harry chose the camera over the crown. Now here's where it gets even more complicated. Charles has always been sensitive to public opinion. He knows better than anyone how unforgiving the press can be. Remember the years after Diana's death? Remember the way he was vilified, painted as cold, unworthy, even monstrous? Charles spent decades trying to rebuild his reputation, decades trying to prove he could one day be king. And just when he finally wore the crown, his own son threatened to drag him back into scandal. That's not just betrayal. That's sabotage. And then there's Camilla. Her role in this cannot be understated. For years, she has been the shadow figure in Charles's life, blamed for Diana's unhappiness, mocked by the press, scorned by the public. Slowly, she clawed her way into acceptance. And finally, when Charles became king, she became queen. But Harry's words in spare? They reopened the wounds. He called her dangerous. He suggested she sacrificed others to polish her image. He attacked the one woman Charles had fought for his entire adult life. Do you think Charles could ever forgive that? But perhaps the deepest cut of all was Harry's decision to make private pain public. Royals live by an unspoken code. Never complain, never explain. Keep the family struggles behind palace walls. Harry shattered that code. He exposed the monarchy's weakest points to the world. And in doing so, he crossed a line his father could not ignore. Let's add another layer here. William, the future king. Charles knows that William's position must be protected at all costs. And Harry's accusations against his brother? They weren't just personal. They were dangerous. They threatened the stability of the monarchy itself. How could Charles welcome back a son who had publicly attacked the heir to the throne? To forgive Harry might look like undermining William's legitimacy. And Charles, whatever his feelings as a father, could never risk that as a king. So the roots of rejection run deep. They are roots fed by betrayal, watered by resentment, and tangled in the duty of the crown. This was never just about forgiveness. It was about survival. Charles had to choose between being a father and being a monarch. And when Harry and Meghan knelt before him, the choice was already made. But here's the cruel irony. Harry may have thought that by kneeling, by humbling himself, he could undo the past. He may have believed that blood ties could outweigh public scandal. But Charles's memory was long, his wounds still fresh. And for every plea Harry made, Charles remembered another headline, another interview, another revelation. The more Harry begged, the colder Charles became. And that's the tragedy, isn't it? The roots of rejection weren't grown overnight. They were cultivated over years. They were inevitable, which means Harry and Meghan never stood a chance. But if Charles's decision was rooted in betrayal, it was also reinforced by something else. Something even more powerful than hurt feelings. Because while Charles grappled with his son's pleas, advisors were whispering in his ear. Parliament was watching from the sidelines. William was waiting in the wings. And what Charles heard from them would push him toward a decision no one thought he would dare to make. And when he finally made that decision, it wasn't just a rejection. It was a fatal choice with consequences far beyond the palace walls. But what advice exactly did Charles receive? Who stood with him, and who urged him to close the gates forever? Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What does a king do when blood pulls him one way and the crown pulls him another? He listens. Not to his heart. That would be too risky. He listens to those whose entire lives revolve around one thing, the survival of the monarchy. And that is exactly what King Charles did. Before uttering the words that would exile his son forever, Charles turned to his advisors, to the men and women who have guarded the institution for decades, through scandals, divorces, tragedies, and betrayals. Their warnings, whispered in gilded corridors and written in discreet memos, built the scaffold for his final, fatal decision. Let's start with the atmosphere. Picture the scene inside Clarence's house, or perhaps one of the private chambers in Buckingham Palace. Heavy drapes pulled shut, a fire crackling faintly in the hearth, a table stacked with briefing folders, newspaper clippings, polling data. On one side, Charles, weary, shoulders heavy with the burden of his dual role as father and monarch. On the other side, his advisors, men and women whose loyalty is not to Harry, not to Meghan, not even to Charles as a man, but to the institution itself. The monarchy must survive. That is their creed. That is their oath. The first warning was blunt. Your Majesty, if you allow them back, you weaken the crown. Advisors reminded Charles that the monarchy's greatest weapon isn't money, isn't power, it's mystique. Distance. The sense that royals are untouchable, living embodiments of tradition. Harry and Meghan shattered that illusion when they took the family's darkest struggles and broadcast them to the world. Welcoming them back would be like opening the gates to the enemy. Would the monarchy ever recover its dignity if the very rebels who tried to tear it down were suddenly seated at the royal table again? Then came the political warning. The advisors pointed to Parliament. In recent years, debates had simmered over the relevance of the monarchy, over its cost to taxpayers, over whether it was even necessary in the modern age. Harry and Meghan, by airing grievances about racism and cruelty, gave Republicans ammunition. If Charles welcomed them back, politicians could claim it proved the monarchy was guilty all along. The institution couldn't afford that kind of risk. And what about William? The advisors reminded Charles that he was not just father to Harry. He was father to the future king. William's reputation was fragile, his destiny monumental. If Charles forgave Harry, what message would it send to William? That betrayal has no consequences? That the heir must share the stage with the brother who sought to dismantle him? Advisors warned that this would not just destabilize Charles's reign. It could destabilize William's future reign too. But perhaps the most chilling warning came from those who understand image. The palace press team. They live and die by public perception, by polls, by headlines. They told Charles plainly, Your Majesty, the public will not forgive you if you forgive him. Why? Because millions of Britons still feel betrayed by Harry and Meghan. They left. They took taxpayer-funded security, renovated homes, royal titles, and then turned around and cashed in on royal scandal. Ordinary people, struggling to pay bills, saw the Sussexes signing multi-million-dollar deals while simultaneously mocking the institution they'd abandoned. To bring them back would be seen as a slap in the face to those same taxpayers. Charles, who desperately needs public approval to stabilize his reign, couldn't afford that backlash. And yet, it wasn't just the advisors. There were whispers from the family itself. Imagine Princess Anne, known for her bluntness, looking Charles in the eye and saying, You cannot let them back. Anne, who has spent her life serving without complaint, likely saw Harry and Meghan as entitled deserters. And Camilla. Oh, Camilla. She had endured decades of hatred, whispers, scandal, until finally she was crowned queen. To let Meghan back in would be to reopen every old wound. It would be to share space with the woman who, in Harry's own words, had once been called dangerous. Would Camilla ever allow that? William's stance mattered most. The heir, the steady, dutiful brother who carried on even as Harry burned bridges. Advisors told Charles that William had drawn his own line. He would not tolerate Meghan's return. He might tolerate Harry, in time, but not Meghan. Bringing them back would mean not just a fractured monarchy, but a fractured heir. And Charles, above all, had to protect William. So Charles listened. He listened as one advisor after another, one family member after another, told him the same thing. They cannot come back. Not now. Not ever. The risks are too great. The wounds too deep. The monarchy too fragile. Now imagine the weight of those words. A father who once cradled his son in his arms, who once taught him to fish, to ride horses, to stand tall during ceremonies, now being told to close the gates on him forever. What would you do in his shoes? Would you choose love? Or would you choose duty? Charles chose duty. But make no mistake, he didn't choose it lightly. The night before the fateful meeting, he reportedly paced his chambers. He read and reread the letters from advisors. He replayed Harry's interviews in his mind. He heard Meghan's voice accusing his family of cruelty. He heard Harry's words accusing Camilla of treachery. And he asked himself the same haunting question. If I forgive him, do I doom the crown? That question lingered in the air like smoke. And when Charles finally sat down with Harry and Meghan, when he watched them kneel before him, his advisors' voices echoed in his ears. They were not whispers anymore. They were thunder. Your Majesty, do not bend. So he didn't. And yet, here's the twist. For all the advisors' warnings, for all the logic of politics and monarchy, Charles still hesitated. For just a flicker of a second, he almost wavered. Because no matter how heavy the crown, it sits on the head of a man, a father. And fathers feel pain. Fathers feel love. Fathers feel loss. But in that flicker of hesitation, something else happened. Someone leaned in. Someone whispered one last piece of advice. And that whisper, more than all the others, hardened Charles's heart once and for all. Because what Charles heard next would seal Harry and Meghan's fate, and set the monarchy on a path no one could have predicted. What exactly was whispered? Who dared to give the king that final push? And why did it matter so much? Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It was just a sentence. One line. But sometimes, history doesn't need long speeches. Sometimes, the fate of a family, the destiny of a monarchy, and the image of a kingdom can shift with fewer than a dozen words. For King Charles, those words came like a hammer. Cold, deliberate, and final. You and Meghan are not, and will never be, welcome back. But let's rewind, because before those words left his mouth, the room itself was thick with silence. Heavy curtains blocked out the sunlight. The ticking of a clock echoed in the background, and Harry and Meghan sat across from Charles like defendants before a judge. The kneeling moment had passed, but the tension was worse now. They had said their piece. They had begged. They had appealed not just to Charles the King, but to Charles the Father. And for a moment, just a moment, they thought they might succeed. Harry's eyes were swollen, red from sleepless nights. Meghan's voice wavered as she spoke of the toll exile had taken, of the cruelty of the press in America, of the emptiness that lingered even in their mansion of glass and marble. She spoke of family. She spoke of unity. She spoke of the children, Archie and Lilibet, deserving to know their heritage. The words were well chosen, carefully rehearsed. Perhaps Meghan thought that invoking the grandchildren would soften Charles's heart. But she miscalculated, because Charles had already decided. The begging, the tears, the appeals, they didn't sway him. They hardened him. For every tear Harry shed, Charles remembered another headline. For every plea Meghan made, Charles heard her voice in that Oprah interview, hinting that his family had been cold, even racist. For every mention of family, Charles remembered the memoir Spare, with its revelations about Camilla, about William, about himself. And then came the moment. Charles leaned forward, his hands clasped, his jaw tight. His eyes, those tired, watery eyes that had seen decades of scandal, locked onto Harry's. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His authority wasn't in the volume. It was in the finality. You and Meghan are not, and will never be, welcome back. Silence. Not even the ticking clock seemed to dare continue. Harry froze, his face pale, lips trembling as if he'd just been struck. Meghan's mouth opened, but no words came out. The rejection hung in the air like smoke after a cannon shot. And it wasn't just rejection, it was exile, formal and permanent. Think about the cruelty of those words. Not now. Not perhaps in the future. Not even I need time. It was absolute. Never. It wasn't just a door closing. It was a lock, a bolt, and the key thrown into the sea. But why never? Why such finality? Because Charles wasn't speaking only as a father. He was speaking as a king. And kings, when they make decisions, must think beyond their bloodline. They must think about the institution. The monarchy is not flexible. It is not forgiving. It is not designed for second chances. The monarchy survives because it is firm, predictable, unyielding. And for Charles, welcoming back the Sussexes would have signaled weakness. It would have been the monarchy admitting defeat to two rebels who cashed in on its secrets. Let's not forget, Charles himself lived through decades of humiliation. He knows the taste of scandal. He knows how long it takes to rebuild a reputation. And after only a year on the throne, his reign was already fragile. Polls questioned his popularity. The Commonwealth whispered doubts. Every gesture he made was scrutinized for signs of strength or weakness. To forgive Harry and Meghan would have been to pour fuel on the fire of doubt. He couldn't risk it. But the human side of this moment is haunting. Imagine being Harry. You give up everything, your titles, your military honors, your home. And you believe that, in the end, your father will forgive you because blood is thicker than water. And then you hear those words, never welcome. What do you do in that moment? Fight, argue, rage, or collapse into silence? By all accounts, Harry did the latter. His shoulders slumped. His eyes glazed over. For once in his life, the prince who always had a safety net realized it was gone. And Meghan? For years she had styled herself as the Duchess who conquered Hollywood, the woman who didn't need the palace, who carved her own path. But in that moment, she was not in control. She was not commanding. She was begging, and then she was denied. The rejection wasn't just personal, it was public humiliation, even if the world didn't see it yet. Because make no mistake, word of this decision would leak. And when it did, Meghan's brand of resilience and power would shatter under the weight of rejection. But here's where the fatal part comes in. Charles's decision may have saved the monarchy in the short term, but what about the long term? What about the future when historians look back? Will they say Charles was strong, or will they say he was cruel? Will they praise him for protecting William, or will they condemn him for rejecting his own son? The fatal decision wasn't just in the words. It was in the ripple effect those words would unleash. Because rejection doesn't end in the room. Rejection echoes. It travels. It leaks to the press, ignites debates, fuels documentaries, splits public opinion. Already, the media storm was brewing. Advisors knew it. Parliament suspected it. Even Charles himself must have felt it. His words weren't the end of the conflict. They were the beginning of a new war. And here's the irony. Harry and Meghan came begging for forgiveness, believing it might heal the rift, believing it might give them stability. But Charles's rejection did the opposite. It hardened their resolve. It gave them a new wound to exploit, a new chapter in their narrative of victimhood, a new grievance to sell to the world. By rejecting them, Charles may have secured the loyalty of traditionalists, but he gave Harry and Meghan ammunition for years to come. But perhaps Charles knew this. Perhaps he calculated it. Perhaps he decided that their whining from California would always be less dangerous than their presence inside the palace. Better to fight a war with them outside the walls than to welcome enemies within. And if that was his calculation, it was ruthless. It was cold. And it was, in the eyes of many, fatal. Now let's consider the bigger picture. For centuries, monarchs have exiled family members who threatened the throne. Brothers, cousins, even sons have been cast aside in the name of survival. Charles's decision wasn't new. It was tradition. But tradition comes at a cost. And in this case, the cost was the love of a son. So, the words were spoken. The decision was made. Harry and Meghan were cast out forever. But the story doesn't end there. Because the moment Charles uttered those words, the walls of Buckingham trembled with whispers. Advisors raced to draft statements. The press prepared headlines. Social media waited to explode. And within hours, the entire world would know that Harry and Meghan weren't just estranged, they were banned. But what did the media do with this story? How did the headlines twist it? Did they side with Charles, praising his strength, or with Harry and Meghan, painting them as victims? Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The moment King Charles uttered the words, those final, chilling words, wasn't just the end of a private family meeting. It was the spark that lit a wildfire. Within hours, whispers began to leak beyond the palace walls. And by the next morning, the story was no longer confined to the silence of Clarence House. It was splashed across every front page, shouted from television screens, dissected on social media feeds from London to Los Angeles. The rejection of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle wasn't just a family decision anymore. It was global news. The headlines came fast and sharp. Banished for life, screamed one tabloid, the letters in blood-red font. Another paper, more restrained but equally cutting, asked, "End of forgiveness?" The image of Harry and Meghan, once the darlings of modern monarchy, was now painted as pathetic, desperate, and ultimately humiliated. The media had smelled blood, and they weren't letting go. But the frenzy wasn't just about the drama. It was about the symbolism. Think about it. In a world obsessed with celebrity culture, redemption arcs, and second chances, the idea of two global stars kneeling to beg for forgiveness and being denied was irresistible. It was Shakespearean tragedy dressed in designer clothes. It was Family Feud meets political theater. The media knew it would sell, and so they pounced. Television pundits filled hours of airtime. Clips of Harry and Meghan's past interviews were replayed, spliced against grainy shots of Buckingham Palace gates. In America, sympathetic voices rose. How could a father reject his son like this? In Britain, the tone was harsher. Actions have consequences. Harry chose his path. The divide between nations grew sharper, and the couple found themselves at the center of a global tug-of-war. Heroes in some eyes, villains in others. And then came the memes. Oh, the internet didn't waste a second. Within hours, Twitter and TikTok were flooded with images of Harry kneeling before cartoonish kings, of Meghan clutching her pearls in shock. Captions ranged from cruel jokes to biting commentary. When you quit your job but ask for it back, one meme read, alongside a photo of a groveling Harry. Another compared them to actors auditioning for a role they'd already lost. The internet laughed. And as cruel as it was, the mockery stung far more than the headlines. Because ridicule has a way of sticking. Now, let's pause for a moment. Imagine being Harry and Meghan, sitting in their Montecito mansion, watching this storm unfold. Headlines branding them as outcasts. Social media mocking their desperation. News anchors debating their worth. Can you feel the humiliation? The sense that the whole world was watching, judging, and laughing? For a couple who built their brand on control, on telling their side of the story, this was a nightmare. But the frenzy didn't stop there. Within days, talk shows, podcasts, and YouTube channels devoted entire episodes to dissecting the decision. Was Charles cruel or courageous? Was Harry justified in begging or foolish? Was Meghan a victim of the system or the architect of her own downfall? Every angle was explored, every theory debated. And in the background, the palace press office kept silent. That silence only added fuel to the fire. Because silence, in the media world, screams louder than words. Meanwhile, in Britain, public opinion was shifting. Polls showed a surprising trend. A majority of Britons actually supported Charles's decision. Enough is enough, said one woman interviewed on the streets of London. You can't trash your family in public and expect to be welcomed back. Others agreed. For once, Charles wasn't seen as weak or indecisive. He was seen as strong, resolute, even kingly. The rejection, though brutal, earned him a rare surge of respect. But across the Atlantic, the tone was different. In America, where Harry and Meghan had built much of their post-royal brand, commentators were more sympathetic. This is a family, not just an institution, said one popular host. How can Charles turn his back on his son and grandchildren? Emotional appeals struck chords with audiences who valued personal relationships over tradition. To them, Charles's decision seemed cruel, heartless, even fatal in the moral sense. And that's where the frenzy deepened. The story wasn't just about what happened. It was about what it meant. Was this the monarchy protecting itself or destroying itself? Was Charles acting as a king or as a father? Every outlet framed the story differently, but all agreed on one thing. It was explosive. Even within the royal reporting circle, there was division. Longtime palace correspondents nodded knowingly, saying, this was inevitable. Harry left no choice. Others hinted that the decision might haunt Charles, that history would not look kindly on a father who slammed the door so firmly. The clash of perspectives only kept the story alive, stretching its life cycle from hours into days, from days into weeks. And through it all, one question burned hotter than the rest. What would Harry and Meghan do next? Because the media frenzy wasn't just feeding off Charles's decision. It was waiting for the Sussexes' response. Would they issue a statement? Would they deny the reports? Would they play the victim card, or would they stay silent? The world waited, cameras ready, pens poised. But while the media feasted, there was another player watching closely, the insiders. The royal aides, the courtiers, the staffers who knew the palace better than anyone. and whispers began to spread that one of them was preparing to speak out. That someone inside the institution had a story to tell, a story darker than rejection, a story that would make Charles's words look like the beginning, not the end. Because while the media frenzy painted horror, and when it broke, it wouldn't just be headlines. It would be betrayal on a scale no one could have predicted. Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Every great family drama has a silent player, a figure waiting just beyond the spotlight, shaping events not with loud declarations, but with steady, quiet influence. In this story, that figure is Prince William. For while the headlines screamed about Charles and Harry, about Meghan's humiliation and Charles's cold rejection, there was always another layer. A shadow role, a presence that loomed large, even when it wasn't acknowledged directly. William was that presence, and his influence on this fatal decision cannot be overstated. Let's be clear, William has always represented the future of the monarchy. While Charles is the king, William is the heir. And in every monarchy throughout history, the heir's shadow stretches long, often influencing the decisions of the current ruler. For Charles, this moment wasn't just about his own reign. It was about ensuring that William's reign would not be destabilized before it even began. That means every choice Charles made about Harry was also, in some way, about William. Now, think back to the interviews, the memoirs, the documentaries. Who bore the brunt of Harry's most cutting words? Yes, Charles was accused of being cold, of failing as a father. But William? William was painted as violent, jealous, even cruel. In Spare, Harry revealed a fight where William allegedly shoved him to the ground. He described William as the golden child, the heir who had everything while Harry was cast aside as the spare. Those words cut deeper than anyone realized, not just for William, but for the monarchy itself. Because if the heir is painted as a bully, how can he inspire loyalty as king? Advisors knew this, and William knew this, which is why, behind closed doors, William made his stance clear. Sources close to the palace whispered that William had no intention of forgiving Harry. Not now, not ever. He's crossed too many lines, one insider allegedly said. This isn't just a family feud anymore. It's a matter of trust, and Harry has broken it beyond repair. But let's dive deeper. Imagine William's private conversations with Charles, two future kings, father and son, discussing the survival of the institution. Can you hear the tone? William's voice steady, firm, perhaps even cold. Father, we cannot let them back. Not after what they've done. Not after what they've said about us, about Camilla, about the monarchy itself. Charles, torn between fatherhood and kingship, listened. But the heir's voice carried weight. Because William wasn't speaking as a son. He was speaking as the monarchy's future. And then there's Kate, the Princess of Wales. Her role in this shadow influence cannot be ignored. For years, Kate has been the symbol of stability, the steady hand, the picture-perfect future queen. She has worked tirelessly to embody duty, never complaining, never explaining. But Meghan? Meghan was her opposite, outspoken, dramatic, ready to air grievances to the world. The media framed them as rivals, and Harry's memoir only deepened the divide, revealing private spats and painting Kate as cold and difficult. Do you think Kate would have supported Meghan's return? Would she have wanted to stand beside her on the palace balcony again, as though nothing had happened? Absolutely not. And William, protective of his wife and their image, knew this. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for Kate, for their children, for the monarchy his family was destined to lead. Now let's pause and ask a difficult question. Was Charles's decision truly his own, or was it William's hand guiding the pen? Because in many ways, William was the silent architect of Harry's exile. Advisors warned Charles, yes. Camilla whispered in his ear, yes. But William's stance, the heir's stance, was the deciding factor. Charles could not risk alienating his heir. He could not undermine William by forgiving Harry too easily. The monarchy's survival depended on unity between king and heir. And unity meant siding with William over Harry. The irony, of course, is devastating. Two brothers who once walked behind their mother's coffin together, united in grief, now find themselves on opposite sides of a royal battlefield. The bond that once symbolized resilience after Diana's death is now shattered, perhaps forever. And yet, for William, this wasn't personal anymore. It was strategic. It was about ensuring that when his time comes to wear the crown, there are no lingering shadows of scandal threatening his reign. But let's not paint William as heartless. Behind the shadow role lies a man torn as well. Imagine the private moments. William lying awake at night, replaying the fights with Harry in his mind. The laughter they once shared as boys, now replaced with icy silences. The weight of knowing that when history tells the story, he will be remembered not as the forgiving brother, but as the one who stood firm. Strong, yes, but also cold. And here's where the media frenzy turned its gaze once more. As the news of Charles's rejection spread, whispers about William's involvement began to surface. Headlines speculated. Did William push Charles to reject Harry? Commentators debated whether William was the true force behind the decision. Some praised him for protecting the monarchy. Others condemned him for allowing a personal feud to dictate royal policy. Once again, public opinion was divided, and William, who has always tried to keep his image carefully polished, found himself dragged into the mud. But William didn't flinch. Silence was his weapon, as it had been for years. Where Harry lashed out with interviews and memoirs, William remained the steady one, the silent one, the dutiful one. And in that silence, there was power, because by not speaking, he allowed the public to fill the gaps. And many did so in his favor. At least William isn't airing dirty laundry, they said. At least William is behaving like a future king. Still, one question lingered. Was this the end of the brothers forever? Or was there a chance, however slim, that time might heal the wounds? For William, the answer seemed clear. The door wasn't just closed. It was locked. Harry had chosen his path, and William had chosen his. The two roads no longer ran parallel. They had diverged completely. And yet, here's the twist. William's shadow role wasn't done. Because while Charles made the decision to reject Harry and Meghan outright, William's influence didn't stop there. He had plans of his own, a strategy for the future. A vision of the monarchy without Harry, without Meghan, without the constant shadow of scandal. And in that vision, there was no room for compromise. But what exactly was William's strategy? What steps was he quietly taking behind the scenes to secure his reign, to ensure that Harry's exile was permanent, and to position himself as the true power of the monarchy? Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. If Harry's humiliation and kneeling before his father was tragic, Meghan's desperation in that moment was nothing short of operatic. The Duchess who once walked into Windsor Castle draped in Givenchy couture, the woman who confidently told the world she would redefine the monarchy, now stood, or rather, knelt, on the edge of total collapse. And here lies the bitter irony. Meghan Markle, who built her entire persona around control, independence, and power, found herself stripped of all three. Let's start with the image. Meghan's face, carefully composed in public appearances, was said to be pale, her eyes darting nervously, her lips pressed into a thin line that betrayed the anxiety boiling beneath her polished exterior. She had rehearsed this moment, no doubt, every word, every gesture, every tear timed for maximum effect. Meghan had always been a master of performance, whether on the set of Suits or in a sit-down with Oprah. But this was no stage. This was real, and Charles was no audience to be swayed. He was a monarch, a father-king who had heard it all before. So Meghan doubled down. Her pleas, sources whispered, were more emotional than Harry's. She spoke of being misunderstood, of never being given a fair chance within the firm. She painted herself as the outsider who only ever wanted to serve, the woman who was pushed out by an institution too rigid, too archaic, too unwilling to embrace change. She even invoked the children, Archie and Lilibet, as innocent victims caught in the crossfire of a feud they never chose. Her voice trembled when she said they deserved to know their heritage, to walk in the gardens their grandmother once walked, to be raised with love from both sides of their family. And yet, as moving as those words might have sounded, Charles's face didn't soften. He sat still, almost stone-like. Meghan's tears, her tremors, her impassioned rhetoric, none of it touched him. Because to Charles, this wasn't the first time Meghan had played the victim. He had seen her on Oprah. He had watched her claim she was silenced. He had read Harry's memoir, with passages that bore Meghan's fingerprints. To Charles, this wasn't raw desperation. It was another act, another performance. But Meghan knew what was at stake. She had watched the cracks form in their California empire. The multi-million-dollar Spotify deal gone. The Netflix contract under scrutiny. Invitations to elite circles growing thinner by the month. Hollywood, once so enchanted by the Duchess with royal titles, was quietly moving on. And without the royal brand, without the palace connection, what was Meghan Markle? A former actress? A celebrity clinging to the remnants of past glamour? She couldn't let that be her reality. So in that moment, Meghan wasn't just pleading for re-entry into the royal family. She was pleading for survival, her brand's survival, her legacy's survival. She knew that being the Duchess of Sussex meant nothing if she wasn't welcome in Sussex itself. The titles without the crown's blessing were hollow. And Meghan, more than anyone, understood the value of perception. Without the monarchy's validation, she risked being irrelevant. Let's ask the uncomfortable question. Did Meghan truly want reconciliation, or did she want restoration of power? Was this about family, or was it about image? Because desperation doesn't always come from love. Sometimes it comes from fear. And Meghan feared obscurity more than anything. Now, let's look at Charles's perspective. Imagine a man who has spent his life in scandals, accused of cruelty, painted as unworthy, mocked for his love of Camilla, scorned for decades before finally ascending to the throne. And across from him sits Meghan, who, in just a few short years, inflicted more damage on the monarchy's image than decades of tabloid ridicule ever could. Could he truly forgive her? Could he truly welcome her back into the fold, knowing she had once implied his family might question the skin color of his grandchild? No. To Charles, Meghan wasn't just a daughter-in-law. She was a liability. And yet, Meghan didn't stop. She leaned in. She spoke of Diana, evoking the ghost who still haunted the palace halls. She suggested that Diana would have wanted unity, that Diana would never have allowed such a fracture. It was a bold move, invoking Charles's late ex-wife, the woman who remained a painful wound in his life. But it backfired. Charles stiffened. His jaw tightened. For him, Meghan's words weren't just desperation. They were manipulation. Using Diana's memory to guilt him was unforgivable. Still, Meghan persisted. Because when you've built your identity on resilience, you can't walk away without exhausting every tactic. She tried empathy, tried vulnerability, tried invoking the children, tried invoking Diana. But when all of it failed, her desperation began to show cracks. Her tone shifted. Her eyes hardened. And in that flicker of a second, Charles saw not a pleading duchess but the calculating woman who had once orchestrated explosive interviews and memoirs. Here's where the irony cuts deepest. Meghan, who once promised Harry freedom from the cage of monarchy, was now begging to re-enter it. She had spent years branding herself as independent, as powerful, as beyond the palace's reach. And yet, without the palace, she was powerless. For all her efforts to destroy the crown, she now needed its validation more than ever. But Charles's rejection wasn't just a personal blow. It was a professional one. Because Meghan knew that when the news leaked, and it always does, her humiliation would be public. The Duchess who once stood shoulder to shoulder with world leaders would now be branded as unwanted, unwelcome, unworthy. The woman who claimed to be a royal trailblazer would be seen instead as a royal exile. That's not just a headline. That's a brand killer. And so, Meghan's desperation grew. Whispers say she begged Charles for one last chance, offering compromise, promising discretion, even hinting at loyalty. But Charles didn't bend. His refusal was absolute. And Meghan's face, once filled with determination, drained of hope. She realized she had lost. Not just the argument. Not just the reconciliation. She had lost the narrative. But here's the chilling part. Meghan's desperation didn't die in that room. It transformed. Rejection fuels anger. Humiliation fuels revenge. And Meghan Markle, a woman who has never accepted defeat quietly, was already plotting her next move. Because desperation doesn't end with tears. Desperation hardens into resolve. And Meghan's resolve would ensure that this story didn't end with Charles's rejection. It would only escalate. But what weapon would Meghan wield next? A new interview? Another documentary? A book of her own? Or something even more shocking? Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Every great scandal has its smoking gun. In this saga, it wasn't an overheard conversation, or a leaked audio file, or a secret video. It was a letter, a single sheet of paper, sealed with intent, delivered into King Charles's hands. And once he read it, there was no turning back. That letter became the final nail in the coffin of Harry and Meghan's hopes for reconciliation. Now, what was in the letter? The palace will never confirm. The aides will never admit. The press will speculate endlessly. But insiders whispered enough fragments, enough hints, to piece together a chilling picture. And whether the letter was written by Meghan, by Harry, or by both of them together, its contents confirmed to Charles that forgiveness was impossible. Let's rewind to how the letter came about. After the disastrous kneeling plea, Meghan reportedly insisted on sending Charles a follow-up. She wanted something tangible, something that would outlive the moment, something that could clarify their intentions. But what Meghan saw as clarification, Charles saw as manipulation. The tone of the letter, sources claimed, was a mix of apology and demand. On one hand, it expressed regret for misunderstandings and the way things were perceived. On the other hand, it contained veiled expectations, security, housing, a role in the royal family, and recognition for their children. Do you see the problem? Meghan may have believed she was offering compromise, but to Charles, it read like conditions, terms, almost an ultimatum. And that was the worst mistake she could have made. Because kings don't take ultimatums. They issue them. The letter reportedly began with emotional appeals, references to Diana, to the grandchildren, to the importance of healing. But quickly it shifted tone. It highlighted the couple's sacrifices in leaving the royal family, their contributions to global causes, their unique position to modernize the monarchy. It hinted at what they could offer if allowed back in. And then, this was the fatal part. It hinted at what they might continue to say if they remained outside. That one sentence, subtle, indirect, but unmistakable, was the line that Charles could not forgive. To him, it wasn't reconciliation. It was blackmail, a reminder that Harry and Meghan still held the power to damage the monarchy with their words. And Charles realized then that bringing them back wouldn't silence them. It would embolden them. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Advisors later suggested that the letter wasn't just Meghan's idea. Some believed it was her strategy, her way of framing the narrative. Others believed Harry reluctantly signed on, still desperate for his father's approval. But either way, when Charles saw both their names at the bottom of the letter, he made his choice. He would never, never allow them back. Now, imagine Charles reading it, alone in his study, the fire crackling, his glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose as he scans each carefully chosen word, his hands trembling not with emotion but with fury. He pauses, sets the letter down, then picks it up again, rereading the line that changed everything. And in that moment, any flicker of softness, any hesitation, vanished. His resolve hardened like steel. From that point forward, it was no longer just about betrayal. It was about survival. Harry and Meghan, in trying to negotiate their way back in, had proven to Charles that they could never be trusted. They were liabilities. They were dangers. They were a threat to the stability of the monarchy. And kings do not invite threats into their halls. But here's the cruel irony. Meghan may have believed the letter was her strongest weapon, the thing that would sway Charles, prove her sincerity, demonstrate her willingness to engage. Instead, it became the weapon that destroyed her chances forever. Because sometimes, words don't heal. Sometimes, they wound deeper than silence. Now, let's consider the historical echoes. Letters have always played pivotal roles in royal history. And Boleyn wrote desperate letters to Henry VIII before her execution. Edward VIII wrote letters defending his love for Wallis Simpson as he abdicated the throne. And now, Meghan Markle's letter joined that infamous legacy, a letter that sealed her exile instead of saving her place. History repeats itself, and this time, the pen was mightier than the plea. But what about the palace? The letter didn't stay locked away in Charles's desk drawer. Fragments of it, leaks of its content, began to seep out. Courtiers whispered to trusted journalists. Phrases like demands, conditions, and expectations began appearing in the press. The narrative was set. Meghan had overplayed her hand. Instead of earning forgiveness, she had confirmed her reputation as manipulative, calculating, and self-serving. Public reaction was brutal. In Britain, the tabloids tore into her. Headlines screamed, Meghan's demands revealed. Editorials condemned her for daring to lecture the king. Social media lit up with hashtags mocking her negotiation tactics. And in America, while some defended her intentions, others began to question, had Meghan finally gone too far? And for Harry, the letter was a double-edged sword. By signing it, he had tied himself to Meghan's words. Whether he agreed with every line or not, his name at the bottom meant complicity. It meant Charles saw not just Meghan but Harry himself as part of the problem. For Harry, who had hoped to rebuild a bridge to his father, the letter burned it down. So, in the end, the letter became more than a piece of paper. It became a symbol of desperation disguised as diplomacy, a symbol of miscalculation that revealed the Sussexes' true priorities, a symbol of the unbridgeable divide between Charles and his son.